Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This week we are doing unicorns. Where do they come from? What animals might they have been thinking about? Why does the unicorn gain such traction in medicine? And which doctor 500 years ago called bullshit on the tradition? The first written record of a unicorn comes from a writer who's writing in ancient Greece in the 4th century BCE. His name is Ctesias, and he's describing a type of wild ass in his book Indica on India. And he says, fleet of foot, having a horn a cubit and a half in length and coloured white, red and black. In the same writings, he also includes a description of an oryx, which is a type of antelope with a similar colouring described. Is it possible that because he's probably relying on word of mouth that he's describing the same animal twice? It's also possible that what he's describing is an Indian rhinoceros. Here's a picture, what do you think? Now in the 1st century CE, Pliny the Elder writes of a fierce animal that he calls a monokeros, which translates as single horn. And this word has got etymological links to the word unicorn, and he says it has the head of a stag, the feet of an elephant, and the tail of a boar, whilst the rest of the body is like that of a horse. It makes a deep lowing noise and has a single black horn which projects from the middle of its forehead, 2 cubits in length. Now, you can kind of see where the idea of a unicorn comes from, but this is not our classic unicorn, and we'll see where this starts to come in later. Now, along with the physical description, Pliny is one of the first to describe their character traits. And he says that they are the fiercest animals in India, not something that today we would associate with a unicorn. But he does say that they are impossible to be captured alive. Now, that is something that we do associate with the unicorn today. So that idea is over 2,000 years old. As you might expect, this idea continues to develop. And in the 6th century CE, a guy called Cosmas, who's a travelling merchant from Alexandria, describes the unicorn's notorious ability to avoid capture. He says that the unicorn's power resides in its horn. Now this is interesting because we're going to get to the medical side of this. Okay, so he says, and this is a fantastic story, I read this and I was like, whatever, okay, this is crazy. So when a unicorn is being chased, it can kind of throw itself off a cliff and land on its horn. How it unplugs itself, I don't know. But the idea starts to arise that the unicorn's power is contained within its horn. Now later in the 3rd century, Marco Polo, he just also talks about unicorns, and what he says is that they spend their time wallowing in mud and slime. Now this is not the unicorn we're thinking of, but we can start to see some of the themes coming through. Now we're about to see another attribute coming through. Okay, so in the 2nd century CE, a Greek Christian text known as the Physiologus, which is basically an early form of a bestiary, those books that arise in the Middle Ages and the medieval period that just talk about animals. In this early bestiary, the idea starts to arise that unicorns can purify poisoned water. And this is going to be really important later on when we think about why especially people like royalty want to get their hands on a unicorn horn. And at this point, you also start to get the idea that unicorns can only be kind of lured and found with the cooperation of a virgin female. So this, along with these characteristics of being able to purify poisoned waters, leads to them starting to be associated with Jesus. And you start to see this in medieval artwork. Now, we'll come back to the Bible, but because the unicorn becomes so closely associated with Jesus Christ, it becomes very popular in medieval heraldry. Because why would you not want to incorporate some idea that you are godlike into your heraldic crest? Now, because of this close association with Jesus, the unicorn becomes a very popular figure in a lot of medieval and Middle Age kind of tapestries and artworks and things like that. And from that, it develops into a very popular symbol of heraldic crests. You can see it in the British Royal Crest, for example, the Scottish Royal Crest. And unicorns are often shown breaking a chain, and that's kind of to symbolize how powerful they are, and it draws back on this idea of Jesus. The idea of a unicorn is so embroiled in our culture at this point that by the 17th century, London newspapers are even containing advertisements for miracle elixirs made of true unicorn horn. And these are said to relieve diseases from ulcers to scurvy to sadness, melancholy, and even to fainting spells. And this is because it all draws back on this kind of biblical tradition. However, As we move forward towards the 18th century, unicorns, like anything really, kind of start to fall out of fashion. But they don't fall out of fashion for long, because as we get into the Victorian era, and there's almost this Victorian, romantic pushback against industrialization, unicorns once again become very, very popular. And that's because the now famous Lady and Unicorn tapestries, which are made around 1500, are romanticized and inspire a lot of Victorian artists. And from then, unicorns have developed into what we now know today, something romantic and magical and mystical and unique. But let's talk about the Bible, because we have seen that unicorns gained a lot in popularity and gained a real foothold in culture because of their links to the Bible. Now, there is a claim that the unicorn is mentioned no less than 9 times in the Hebrew Bible, which is interesting, but it might actually be a mistranslation. So the word re'em, which is a Hebrew word, is an animal, and it has been translated as unicorn in the Latin Bible. But in some Christian traditions, it's literally just translated as oryx. Is this where part of the myth develops? A mistranslation that really, because as Christianity gains a foothold in the Western world, you kind of have what is the word of God saying that the unicorn is real. It's really interesting. Is it just a mistranslation? There is a Bible passage which reads, "Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee, or abide by thy crib? Canst thou bind the unicorn with the band in his furrow?" And this is from Job 39, 9-12. Now, because this word has been translated as a unicorn, if you are a person who lives in any point really over the last 2,000 years, if someone says to you the unicorn is mythological and doesn't exist, it's in the Bible. So it makes it difficult for any person to consider that the unicorn, even as doubts start to set in, and we'll talk about that later when we think about Ambrose Paré, who's saying that the unicorn does not exist. Because today it seems kind of silly, doesn't it, to think that people genuinely believed the unicorn when, even though they were traveling the world, no one had ever seen it, no one could agree what it looked like. But when you believe that the Bible is God's word, and the word unicorn is in the Bible, it's in Job, why would anyone who's living in the 15th, 16th, 17th century disagree with that idea? It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? It makes sense to me that is why that they would wholeheartedly believe that this myth is real. More so, why would they not pay loads and loads of money for unicorn horn cures when they're so closely related to Christ? It makes sense to me. Now, there is artwork from all over the world about the hunt of the unicorn, in China, in the Islamic world, and loads in the Western world. And people want to hunt the unicorn because they believe that the unicorn horn can purify poison waters, as we've seen. And people are really afraid of poison, in previous centuries. Lots of apothecaries, lots of people are selling unicorn horn, and they sell it in lots of different ways. We know today that they weren't selling unicorn horn. So what were they actually selling? Well, it was most likely, if it was a ground up powder, and we'll talk about the powder in a minute, it was most likely things like ground up elephant's teeth, or teeth in general. And then the horns that they were selling, that was likely things like a narwhal tusk or even an elephant tusk. And they had a really big problem with counterfeiting even then, which is kind of bonkers because, people wanted to make sure that they were getting the real unicorn horn and not the false stuff. But obviously today we know it's all false. Let's look at some texts. So in Pommett's Complete History of Drugs, the unicorn's horn is mentioned as being able to cure all sorts of malignant fevers, the biting of servants, and mad dogs, so rabies, I presume. And unicorn horn can often be boiled down with cochineal and saffron to create a sweet tasting jelly. Now, we can't discount the placebo effect, I guess. Now, Queen Elizabeth is a known believer in this remedy, and she is known to have paid £10,000 for a unicorn horn and was known to drink her drinks from what she believed was a unicorn horn, because people are believing that it protects you from poison. And if you're a queen in 1600s, 1500s, that is what you want to protect against, okay? You have many enemies. Okay, in his 1651 text, James Primrose notes, "It can scarce be said whether the bezoar stone or to the unicorn's horn the common people attributes greater virtues, for those who have thought to be the prime antidotes of all." So the unicorn horn is not a simple antidote. It offers renewed strength and vigor, even if you are healthy. Everyone wants to get their hands on this stuff, but it's expensive because it doesn't exist. The majority of practitioners advise that the horn is ground down into a powder and mixed with water and drunk, which now we are kind of imagining what they were kind of drinking is kind of gross. In the text Complete Herbal, Nicholas Culpeper describes a cordial powder made of hartshorn, unicorn's horn, pearls, ivory. I mean, kind of the cost of this, you know. And all of this is beaten into a fine powder, and this is obviously for the elite of the day. No one can afford this, but this is what apothecaries are selling. Now, there are even, of the day, ways to tell whether your unicorn horn is the real deal or whether it's counterfeit. Okay, so what you have to do is you have to, into a hollow horn, you put a spider, and if she passes over, it will be a counterfeit horn. But if she bursts and dies, it's natural. Now, not everyone believes in the unicorn horn. So in 1580, you have an incredible pioneering surgeon called Ambrose Paré. Now, this guy has served 4 French kings. He is an incredible surgeon, well ahead of his time. And in 1580, he's treating a knight called Christoffel des Ursins, who's had a serious injury falling from his horse. Now, during his recovery, this knight des Ursins says to Paré, why do you not use famous remedies, aka things like unicorn horn, or, you know, mummy flesh, that kind of thing. You know how they used to grind down the mummies, all that kind of thing. Paré does not care about this stuff. He's not using that. And obviously this is unusual. It tells us something about the time. You know, des Ursins, obviously he's a knight, he's got access to all this money, and this is obviously the stuff that he's usually getting thrust at him, and Paré's not interested in that. And des Ursins is interested, and he wants to know why. And Paré says he does not believe in the benefits of such remedies, and that this is pertaining to the mummies. The old Jews, Arabs, Chaldeans and Egyptians had not embalmed their dead for Christians to eat them. And this is probably one of the most sensible comments of all time. But des Ursins is actually really surprised by this, and he encourages Paré to write on this topic. Now, 2 years later, Paré, he's old by this point, he's 72 years old, which for the day is ancient. He publishes a book called Discourse of the Unicorn, it's 1582, which he dedicates to this knight. And he's a bit untouchable, Paré, in this period. He's going to get really criticised for this, but he's kind of untouchable because he's a really big favourite of King Henry III of France and his wife Catherine de Medici. So Paré really does not care what you think about him. Like, the French king loves him, he does not care. But a lot of people are really upset by this book on unicorns. Like, this is a controversy of its day. Because obviously there's a lot of people who are making a lot of money, we know, grinding down dog bones or whatever it is that they're selling and selling it to people. So there is one chap who kind of calls him out and says, you've got no competence to this topic and you shouldn't be talking about it. But you know, Paré is not bothered, and he says to people have travelled all over the world and no one can agree what a unicorn looks like. That no one has ever seen one. There is no report, you know, not since like ancient Greece. And now that we have thought about, you know, how, you know, we're not millions of miles away from the Spanish Inquisition, you know, the Bible really is king in this period in the West. And so what Paré is saying is kind of bold, because we know that the unicorns are featured in the Bible. But Paré is not bothered about that. He thinks it's a fable, and he is going to put his head on the block, quite literally, not quite literally, he's not executed, but he is going to stand out there and say the unicorn is not real. But we know that the belief will prevail long after Paré, but this is what he's saying. Paré actually says some said it looked like a horse, others said it looked like a donkey, others claimed it looked like an elephant. Some claim there is more than one unicorn species, but for him it's a fable. So Paré says he's not the first person to raise concerns about the existence of unicorns, and loads of people, loads of other doctors had said that they'd never found any basis this actually works. And this makes my little Dr. Heart feel so great, because this is evidence-based medicine. You know, these doctors are doing their doctor thing, they're trying a bit of unicorn horn and it's not helping, and they're saying this is not working, which is how we get rid of superstition, guys, because you try it and you see if it works, and it doesn't. Paré is actually kind of known for debunking all kinds of weird myths. In one book he says the unicorn is something more imagined than real and natural. But yeah, he really upsets people, and in 1583 an anonymous author, that tells you how powerful Paré is. People are writing anonymously in the 16th century. But it was probably the botanist Jacques Dalchamps or a surgeon named Mr. Lejeune, and someone writes a response to Ambrose Pare's discourse regarding the use of unicorn. And in this account, they compare him to Lucifer. So this is what people feel about the unicorn in this time. Now, Pare does not take this lying down. He decides to launch a counterattack via his retort of Ambrose Pare to the response made about his discourse of the unicorn. And it's hilarious because this is like your top surgeon in the world, or it's certainly in France, maybe not the world, because at this point we know that their Islamic medicine is crazy incredible. I'm going to do a video about that because their surgical tools are incredible, guys. But basically, these are like the top doctors of the time, and they are writing discourses on unicorns. And in my little doctor heart, I do love this. Anyway, Pare says, putting aside the animosities of the discourse, which I consider to have escaped him, the more zeal he has for the truth than for the opinion he has of me. If he wants to oppose my work, he should move past the animosities he has against me. And so I just love this guy. He's even saying, you know, people are attacking him and comparing him to Lucifer, and he's just like, focus on the science, dude. It really doesn't matter to me what you think about me. Focus on the science. And that is what scientists should do. I love this. There's even a dean of medical schools who attacks Pare, and he basically says that he should focus on surgery because that's where his true skills are, and that he doesn't know anything, and there's loads of people who, like apothecaries, who know what they're doing. And Pare says the fact that the unicorn horn has been used for a long time basically does not mean that it does anything. People are so angry with him that they actually go to the king and queen and try and get him, you know, in trouble. But the king does not give a shit about this. He's like being the king, and he's like, I don't care. This is Pare. He's a great surgeon. I'm not bothered about this. And so, despite Pare's intervention and other doctors who'd been intervening, we see that the unicorn horn beyond, because obviously Pare is talking in the 1580s, the unicorn horn continues to kind of grow until we get a little bit of a scale back in the 18th century. But then obviously in the Victorian period, it returns with a fervour and becomes, you know, the fever that we know and love. Luckily, we don't still think that it's useful for detecting or treating poisons. But it was really interesting, and the reason I wanted to make this video is because it's really interesting, in my opinion, to see how something goes from being a myth, however this myth starts, to being something that people are really impassioned about, and a reasoned discourse like that of a genius like Pare just doesn't seem to do anything, even with the educated at the time professionals who are selling this. And it's really interesting and really cool, and you know, it makes me wonder what will we know in years to come. So I hope you liked this video, guys. I thought that we should take a break from all the vaults we've been climbing into lately. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you like my videos. There are plenty of others if you are interested. If there's anything you'd like me to cover, please do let me know. Leave me comments. Thank you. Bye.